right, our speaker is Annalisa Heppner she is the director of the North Burial Ground on Branch Avenue in Providence. I guess it's the oldest cemetery in the city. She's going to talk to us about the history of the North Burial Ground and the landscape of it, and most interesting of all, I guess, would be the people who are buried there. Many famous, I guess others anonymous. Annalisa is an advocate of studying history through cemeteries, which sounds gruesome, but I bet it's fascinating, and she certainly will make it so. So without any more intro, I'm going to turn this meeting over to Annalisa Heppner.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk about North Burial Ground. And it's kind of a role in Providence. All right. So this is just a quick picture of our receiving tomb, which we don't actually use anymore. But I love this picture because you can see a really neat mix of our historic receiving tomb. We have some cool landscaping. You can see these kind of early 20th century graves over here, and then our contemporary burial ground. And one of the coolest things about NBG is that even though we are the city cemetery, we were founded in 1700, we're still going strong. So we've been burying people for 323 years, and we bury people 3 to 5 times a week here. So we are an active and historic cemetery. So everybody that comes here is part of that long history and contemporary social life at the same time. And I think it's really cool. I love it. So some quick NBG history, and throughout the presentation, there'll be some pictures of different headstones and just views kind of around the cemetery that I love. So we were founded officially in 1700. The first burial was in 1711. However, Providence was founded in 1636, and families were probably using the land that became North Burial Ground for burial before the formal cemetery was established. So the parcel of land that kind of that became the cemetery was always seen as part of the municipality's like common land. It was this kind of duney rolling hill with like hills with lots of barberry, and it was kind of land that people didn't really want to use. It wasn't great for cattle grazing. It wasn't great for growing much of anything. And it really became kind of the unpleasant commons, which is what we kind of joke about it. So early burials, definitely from before that 1711 date. And then it was also an animal pound for a while. So we had a dog pound here. The stocks and the gallows were here. It was a military training ground for a while. So it's always been kind of this like municipal multi-use space. There are some really funny early accounts too of as all the barberry got kind of cleared out and the military came in and like militia training ground, like opened up the landscape, people sneaking their gardens in, which is very funny. So you have these like accounts from like 1720 that are like, you know, the city council wants to formally ask so-and-so to stop planting his vegetable garden in the burial ground. We need to use that. And it's pretty funny, I think. North Burial Ground has always been a non-denominational cemetery. It was open to everyone, regardless of race, religion, or any other status. And it was not formally segregated. So when you come to North Burial Ground, you come to the oldest parts of the cemetery, you have a whole mix of people buried together, including, like I said, kind of when we were chit-chatting in the beginning, Stephen Hopkins, our signer of the Declaration of Independence, is buried directly across from the people that he enslaved. So we have this really rich mix of colonial life. It wasn't formally segregated until the 1800s, and then that did happen. And we've always maintained a free ground or a potter's field or stranger's vale, depending on kind of what the fashionable way to refer to those places were at the time. But those are burials for indigent people, or in the city of Providence's history, people who were cared for by a city government entity called the Overseer of the Poor. And we're kind of in the beginning chit-chatting a little bit about North Burial Ground's reputation. And there is this misconception about the cemetery that it is only for indigent people. It's not, it's for everybody. North Burial Ground's open to everyone. It expanded from an initial 46 acres through eminent domain, land purchase, and land donations over that first kind of 200 years. And we kind of capped off for a while. We got up to 150 acres, we lost some acreage, and now we're at 110. And we grew along with the city. So as Providence expanded and you need more roads, the practice of burying people at home, which was very, very common in colonial New England. So you have like little family cemeteries, that land needed to be used. And so people moved their whole little family cemeteries into the North Burial Ground space. I think our last movement was in like 1925. So pretty common to do that. In the 1840s to the kind of early 20th century, we saw a lot of updates in our landscaping. So early New England burial ground is kind of what you think of when you think of a like spooky old cemetery with the kind of uniform slate stones and maybe a tree, but it's really kind of open and bare and all the graves face the same direction. And in the 1830s, 1840s, there was a real movement towards rural cemeteries, or garden cemeteries are what they were called, which is a landscaped experience. So it looks like a park, right? You can think of these as kind of the precursors to the big parks of the time. So before there was Roger Williams Park, North Burial Ground went through this space or this kind of like revamp, and the same in New York City. So before there was Central Park, there was Greenwood Cemetery. So cemeteries really are kind of the beginning of this municipal parks, which I think is really cool too. And we really did our revamp to compete with our neighbor Swan Point, which is a private cemetery that I totally encourage you all to visit. It's beautiful there. And they are one of the real pinnacles of the garden cemetery. And the municipality was watching all of the kind of families with a lot of money go to Swan Point, and they said, okay, well, we have some work to do to keep up. So over our 322-year history, there are periods of really intense utilization and development, and then periods of really profound neglect. And I like to talk about, or at least mention, those periods of neglect, because one of my jobs is to reassure kind of the public and the city of Providence. So both our constituencies, like people who come to the cemetery, but also the city council, that like, now is a time for development and investment in historic preservation and using the cemetery and making sure that we take care of it for the next 323 years. And to make people feel like, okay, well, North Burial Ground will actually be taken care of forever. That's a promise that we make to the people buried here, that they are cared for in perpetuity. And so I'm trying to make sure that we always stay out of those periods of neglect, but it's important to acknowledge that they happened. I just included this headstone. This is one of my favorite headstones in the cemetery, and I haven't seen all of them. There are over 40,000 headstones at North Burial Ground. 100,000 over 100,000 burials and around 40,000 headstones. And this is Mary. She died of tuberculosis in 1871, and she was 8. And this little ballerina girl, there's not another one like this. I think it's really cool. And then up on top, you would have seen there were flowers and a ribbon, and it's such a, even though it's disintegrated, it's marble. Marble is not a great headstone material, turns out. I think you really see this very personal picture of a young lady, and that was one of the really kind of cool hallmarks of Victorian cemetery culture, was the idea that you were really wanting to depict something and tell a story about the person's life that's buried there. So I love this one. It's worth a visit. Okay, so what does a cemetery director do? People ask me this all the time. So my job title is city cemetery director. And I wear a lot of hats. So in other cemeteries, sometimes this job would be called the superintendent. Sometimes this job would be called the sexton. So it's my responsibility to make sure that the cemetery is taken care of, landscape wise, records wise. I manage our budgets. I develop and manage our improvement projects, and I plan for burials and maintain our relationships with funeral homes, monument companies, all of the things that you need to run a modern cemetery. I included this picture because James Warren here is who I would have been in the past, though I don't think I could rock the mustache the same way James Warren did, but I think it's really interesting to see these kind of different folks. We don't have a board of commissioners specifically for the burial ground anymore. And this is from, I think this is 1915 is when this little plate is from. More excitingly, I think, is I work with people. So I provide customer service to our constituents. So that's people who come for burials. That's people who come to experience the cemetery for recreation, who come for events, and who come for cultural events. And I do all of our community engagement. So I do things like this. I do our social media, and I run all of our educational and cultural programming. And we'll talk about it a little bit more, but I really encourage you all to come on November 2nd. We do a Dia de los Muertos celebration in Day of the Dead. And we partner with Rhode Island Latino Arts to do that. And I'm Mexican. So when I came to the burial ground, something I really wanted to do was bring this aspect of my culture to the cemetery. And turns out Rhode Island Latino Arts also does a Day of the Dead celebration. And they were looking for a home for it. And I said, come to North Burial Ground. And it really worked out. So we've done it 2 years in a row. It's been really, really fun. And I love the contrast between these guys and me. So I'm an archaeologist. Just really quickly, we won't talk too much about me, but I'm an archaeologist. That's my area of academic expertise. I have a master's degree in archaeology and anthropology from the University of Alaska. And before I got into the cemetery industry, I was a working archaeologist, mostly around Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. And I came here to work at Brown with a collection from Northwestern Alaska. So it was a windy road to get here, but it's been amazing how much overlap there is and how doing this job fulfills a lot of the same things that I loved about archaeology. So working with the past, getting to know people, and serving my community, which is basically all the good parts of archaeology. And okay, so we're going to transition a little bit from the intro to talk a little bit about our records, because one thing that we get tons of questions about is genealogy. Cemeteries are great repositories for genealogical information. And if you've been around since 1700, you have the ancestors of a whole lot of people. And I think the records part of what we do is really fascinating. So formal records didn't happen at North Burial Ground until 1848. So we got 148 years of no records. So everything we know about that first 148 years comes from headstone survey and like city ordinance. So there's some things that are kind of like recorded in the city ordinances. The information in a cemetery, and I think this is applicable to most cemeteries that you go to, with the exception of religiously affiliated cemeteries. The information is about the cemetery and its operations and less about the people that are buried here. So the most important stuff that we see, or the most important stuff that the cemetery sees is important, is where is somebody buried, how much did it cost to bury them, and when they were buried. So we have kind of a couple different types of books that we consult. So we've got a record of burials, which is a list chronologically of everybody in the day that they were buried. That's what this is a picture of, a superintendent's record. Ooh, trying to zoom in. Superintendent's record of burials from, I think this is 1871. And you can see the date and the day, the name, how old the person was when they passed, where they lived when they died, who their undertaker was, so the funeral home, and then where in the cemetery they're buried, and other remarks like, did they pay in full? Did they spend time in the receiving tomb? And right now, though most of this has been transferred into Excel, to get the right information, we have to search our records manually. So when you come to ask about an ancestor or a relative buried at North Burial Ground, we're pulling out a book. Because especially I find historical societies are really interested in genealogy, I just wanted to share a little bit about how you can ask the best kind of things to know. So you definitely want to know the year that somebody died, their full name, and any nicknames. We especially have a lot of Armenian people buried at North Burial Ground, and the Armenian language is really cool. And people have usually an English name and an Armenian name, and it just depends on when they were buried and who took their name down, if they use their Armenian name or English name. So if you've got anything like that, make sure you have all the names that the person might be listed under. We specifically have a genealogy request, so you can fill it out with all that information, or you can email it to us. And it takes a while, right? We have to look all of this up, and you can see. So this little zoom in here is a zoom in on like where people are buried in the cemetery, so we can find the person's name, and then we also have to figure out that they're on the southwest part of ground, west side of central corner. You're like, well, okay, where is that? So you got to like go on the map and figure out where these kind of like directions are. We do not keep death, birth, or marriage certificates, so we don't keep any of that kind of information. We don't keep people's religious affiliations, though some places it's a little bit clearer. There's a Quaker section, for example. There's a Muslim section. But we do keep name, date of burial, age of death, undertaker, and location of burial. So in some ways, it's a lot of information, and a lot of times we end up kind of selling it short because we don't keep the rest. So we don't know who was married to who necessarily, unless they're buried in the same lot. And even then we might not know if they were related or not. So yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting piece of this. So this is going to be hard to look at. It's hard to get a picture of North Burial Ground onto a PowerPoint slide or a map of North Burial Ground on a PowerPoint slide, because we are, 110 acres. So if you come visit me here, which you should, I'm in the main office right here in front of the main entrance. So you're kind of down here in the south part. This is Branch Avenue. This is North Main Street. And the oldest parts of the cemetery are here. So can you guys see my mouse? Is that tracking? Is that kind of hard to see? You're looking at the kind of from basically where it says pedestrian access gate here to a little bit farther north to this other pedestrian access gate is the initial start of the cemetery. So this is where you'll find our graves from the 1700s on. Stephen Hopkins, our signer of the Declaration of Independence, is right here. He's easy to spot because he's got an obelisk and like 4 monuments from the Daughters of the American Revolution. They love a monument. We love that for them. And then as you go farther north, you kind of move, you move a little bit, you move deeper in time. So as you go north, you move into the kind of early 19th century. So over here is the Brown Mausoleum. We'll see some pictures of these things that I'm talking about. And that space is where the Browns who founded Brown University are all buried. So they're there. And then as you kind of come down, what you're actually doing, you're up on the top of the crest right here. So you come down a hill and you enter into this what was beautifully landscaped kind of big flat area with a pond. And that's kind of our late 19th century, early 20th century section of the cemetery. And then you loop around. This is the Potter's Field back here. And these are the free grounds. So these sections here are all those kind of the burials for indigent people that we talked about. And then you move all the way up and you go kind of like forward, or you can keep going forward in time until you come down to the front here, which is where our contemporary burials happen. So you can kind of like time travel as you go north and then back south in the cemetery. Okay, so here's some pictures, because what's a cemetery tour without actually getting to look at the cemetery? So I just have a few kind of not befores and afters, but I think these are great contrasts. So these pictures were taken in 1900 as a part of the cemetery's like documentation of all this new work that they did, and also as postcards. So we used to sell these as postcards, which I think is really fun. So this is the entrance. I love this picture, honestly, because you can see there's a person right here. And in the 1900s, in the 1880s, even earlier, really, 1850s on, the cemetery was like the place to be. So thousands of people would come through North Burial Ground to go on walks, to meet their friends for recreation. And we're at the kind of the southern tip of the Blackstone Valley corridor. And North Burial Ground was a place where a lot of folks who worked in those mills actually got to have some green space. So we've kind of kept up that tradition. And right now we are Providence's second largest urban green space. So I think that's really cool. We're only smaller than Roger Williams Park, so we are pretty big. This is my office now. So it's a rainy day, but you can see like the building hasn't changed, right? Except we have significantly less English ivy, which is good. This is the marble steps. So these are a pedestrian entrance from North Main Street. This was built in 1898. This is leftover marble from the State House, which I think is hilarious. And not hilarious, it's actually really cool. And you can also look when you're in North Burial Ground and you're kind of at the crest of the hill and you look back to the south, you can see the State House a lot of times. So you can kind of like see this relationship between the State House and the burial ground through Providence, like over space, which is really cool. The marble steps are in pretty drastic need of repair. So a couple of things that we'll talk about as I'm showing you these pictures are those instances of neglect that I talked about. And I don't mean this as a knock to anybody who worked here in the past, but things like marble stairs need a lot of upkeep, right? The State House needs a lot of upkeep. And that just didn't happen. The burial ground wasn't always a priority for the mayor or the Parks Department or the Department of Public Works, which we used to be housed under. So, differential interest in the burial ground led to different outcomes, or led to kind of negative outcomes. And one of those negative outcomes is the marble steps. So they are largely deteriorating. And we have a tentative plan to repair them. These are kind of my guinea pigs this is kind of my guinea pig for how willing the public is to invest in historic preservation in the burial grounds. We do a fundraising event. We did a fundraising event this year specifically for restoring the steps and kind of replanting around them as well. And then this is all, you see you have the wrought iron fence here, and then the rest of it's all chain link back here. So also replacing the fence. And the event was really fun. I'll talk a little bit more about events a little bit later in the presentation, but I encourage you to come out to any of these. It's a blast to come here, I think. So this is another one of our kind of main features from that late 1800s, early 1900s re-landscaping of the burial ground. So we used to have 4 ponds. Now we're down to 1 pond, and this is it. So there actually was another pavilion on this side. So you had these 2 kind of pavilions looking at each other, and this very Victorian fountain and pond set up. And now it's been kind of rewilded. So all of this is all grown in, and there is amazing biodiversity in the pond. So we've lost this kind of manicured look, which is okay. And in return, we have Fowler's toads. We have river otters come in every once in a while. There is actually an outlet for this pond. So river otters come in every once in a while. We've got muskrats that live there, all sorts of fish. And we also have, which is really fun, this is the best place to spot them, there are fireflies in the burial ground. So the pond has really become this symbol of our commitment to environmental stewardship. It needs a lot of work right now. But we have some kind of big plans to turn the pond into, we don't necessarily want to go back to this look, right? We don't want to be that, it's no longer a Victorian cemetery, but increasing things like, maybe a little gazebo for gathering space or a living arbor for gathering space, and making sure that the pond stays healthy for all those critters that I just talked about. And then this is the John Carter Brown lot and mausoleum. So this is basically the same view. When I took this picture, I was standing on this curb right here. So this is one of our only real mausolea in the cemetery. And this used to be, unfortunately, you can't see it behind the tree, but this used to be a stained glass window here, and there was stained glass all along the side. That's all gone now. But the Brown family is buried in this lot and in the mausoleum, and it's kind of our big feature in the 1800 section of the cemetery. We had an event here this fall that we called the Mausoleum Hill Sessions, and it was also another event that benefited our historic preservation programming. And we had an acoustic musician come out. We did a concert, and I know that can be a little bit controversial, but I like to think that especially Natalie Curtis, not Natalie Curtis Berlin, that was another lady, but Natalie Baird Brown is buried here, and she was a huge patron of the arts. And so, I like to think that the folks that are buried, especially in this section, because this is a lot of the early, a lot of Providence's golden age, a lot of Gilded Age folks are buried in this section, and they loved a benefit concert. That was like their whole thing. So we thought it was fitting. And then, unfortunately, I don't have any photos of the receiving tomb from back in the day, but this is the receiving tomb. This is a sketch from when they designed it. And our receiving tomb was, when it was built in the 1900s, it was 1903 when it was completed, was state of the art. So you can see here, this is a berm, and this is a berm, and you can see in this picture, the receiving tomb goes into the slope. So if you're not familiar with what a receiving tomb is, that is a tomb for people to be stored in, basically, and held in until the ground was soft enough to dig. So people overwintered in the receiving tomb, and or even longer than overwinter. Sometimes people stayed in it longer because their family was like raising funds to buy a burial lot. And the front of the receiving tomb had this really beautiful like parlor room with like 2 fireplaces where you could hold the funeral, and then you'd be taken into the back, and the back goes all the way into this hill, so it's really cold in there and stays really cool. And there were mausoleum shelves that could open, basically, and we could hold around 300 people in the tomb at a time. And it was very busy. We were one of the only cemeteries at the time with a receiving tomb. And when it was built, it was the thing. It fell out of use in the 70s. And it fell out of popularity really for use in the 50s. And then they closed it in the 70s. And this is another one of my examples, my kind of go-to examples of that kind of neglect that we talked about. So you can see here, there's a tree growing up it and some poison ivy, but this is a chimney. There's another chimney on the other side. You can see them here. And this is my white whale of a historic preservation project. One of the things that we really lack at North Burial Ground is indoor gathering space. I don't have anywhere to hold a reception after a funeral. I don't have anywhere to hold a indoor lecture or anything like that. And I would love to see the receiving tomb and its parlor restored. We don't really need a receiving tomb anymore. We can dig all year round because of heavy equipment, right? But thinking about ways to increase capacity for cremation and thinking about kind of indoor niche spaces, I think would be a great use for this space. So it's kind of one of my big dreams to see it restored. It's really cool. And right now it just holds heavy equipment, which is not the best use for it. Okay, so we're going to talk about people now. So that was kind of a brief well, it wasn't even that brief. That was just an overview of the cemetery itself. And I want to talk to you about some people from a series that I call Dared to Live Different. And Dared to Live Different is a combo series. It's a tour that I offer spring through fall, so you can come and do this in person. It's also an intermittent series on social media, which is actually where I kind of conceived of it. So we do an Instagram and Facebook post about these folks every so often. And I like to think of it as a way to dive into the vault and meet some of the NVG residents that you might not have heard of. This is a picture of our vault door. So this is the vault where we keep all of our records, and it's like a fireproof vault. Well, a fire resistant vault, because we don't actually have the combination for this anymore. So it doesn't close all the way to really truly be fireproof, but you know, it is what it is. And so to be included in the Dare to Live Different series, any time period in North Burial Grounds history, and people who defied the norms of their time for better or for worse. So sometimes I include people who didn't necessarily do great things, but people who are interesting. And hopefully the idea of Dare to Live Different is people you might not have heard of already. And these are all people with some level of fame or notoriety, because that's kind of what you can get easy history on. But they're not the Hopkinses, the Browns, or Roger Williams, who was once buried here for a while. So we're talking about people who are a little bit different. So, okay, we'll start in with one of my favorite people buried at North Burial Ground. She's one of probably our most famous residents outside of the kind of American Revolutionary War history. And Sarah Helen Whitman was Sarah Helen Powers before she was Sarah Helen Whitman. So she was part of Providence's elite founding families. She was briefly Edgar Allan Poe's fiance, and we mostly know Sarah Helen because of her relationship to Poe. But aside from that, she was so cool. So she was a feminist, an abolitionist, early suffragette, and a proponent of the temperance movement. She was also really into transcendentalism and spiritualism. She was an essayist, a speaker, a literary critic, and she was like exactly the kind of woman that you can imagine Edgar Allan Poe falling for. So when Sarah Helen was widowed, after she went through her Victorian mourning period with all Black, she wore a version of mourning clothing in all white. And she had like a little coffin necklace that she liked to wear. And Poe, the story goes that Poe fell in love with her one day when he was walking down Benefit Street with his friend. And he saw Sarah Helen out in her yard trimming rose bushes with a veil on and a full big white dress, like she was in mourning, but reverse mourning. So she was a character, right? And they had a really tempestuous relationship. So they were pretty hot and heavy. And he really pursued her because she was rich, and nobody liked that Poe was going after Sarah Helen because she was wealthy and he was kind of a mess, right? Like he was this like poet who drank too much and was always on the verge of ruin. And sure enough, the reason that they broke up was because the night before their wedding, like her one condition for marrying Poe was that he had to give up the sauce. And the night before their wedding, somebody saw him out and about, wrote her an anonymous letter and said, "We've seen Poe drinking wine at the Athenaeum." And she broke up with him. And I think there's probably other stuff too, but she broke up with him. And the story goes that Poe came the next day to beg for her to take him back, and she wouldn't hear of it, but he was like really persistent. So to get him to leave, she chloroformed herself. She like breathed in like a handkerchief of ether, fell onto her like couch and said, "I love you," and then passed out and had her mom, Anna Power, who was also like a real strong woman, give Poe the boot. But Poe died a year later, and when he died, he was really out of favor in the literary community, and his writing was like, everybody kind of thought like, oh, this is just like, it's not good anymore. And he had this kind of literary frenemy that ruined his name. But Sarah Helen Whitman refused to let that happen to Poe. So she kind of protected and guarded his legacy, and she was really responsible for making Poe the name that we know of today. So she pushed to get his works published. She defended him in her own writing. And we really owe the debt of Edgar Allan Poe to Sarah Helen. So I just think that she is a real character and super fun. All right, so another one of my favorite people, and I didn't include the picture of her because I couldn't find it on my computer, honestly, is the only reason. So Edward Mitchell Bannister and his wife, Christiana Carteau Bannister, were the coolest people in 1870s Providence. He was a painter. He was a founder of the Providence Art Club. He was like a super hot landscape painter. And his wife, Christiana, owned hair salons and wig shops. And she was super wealthy. They had all the money. They threw all these fundraising parties, and they were really important in both Providence's art community and Providence's Black community, like Victorian Black community at the time. And one of their kind of big claims to both their commitment to community and their ability to throw a great fundraiser was during the Civil War, the Union Army conscripted Black soldiers and then refused to pay them. So Christiana and Edward threw a series of fundraising parties to raise enough money to pay, I think it was one of the Massachusetts regiments for their entire Civil War, for their entire service in the Civil War, the whole regiment. And they were also, Christiana especially, but they were also instrumental in founding the Home for Aged Colored Women, which was a benevolent society for women of color. Christiana was Narragansett and African American, and they founded this benevolent society to care for women who were poor at the end of their lives, and they have a burial lot in the burial ground too. So they were just these huge pillars of Providence's community. And Edward Mitchell Bannister's kind of rise to fame was through his landscape painting award at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, but also through his relationship with his wife, who was tapped into society with her wig shops and her hairdressing shops, and through the Providence Art Club. She was also really foundational to the Providence Art Club with her husband. And yeah, they were cool. They were very cool. I would, out of all the people that we talk about in North Burial Ground that I would love to meet, it would be these two. Like, I feel like they were just like, she was in fashion, he was an artist. They must have just been so cool. Okay, so a little bit different, a little less fancy, a little more risque are Frank and Annie Packard. And Frank and Annie Packard were tattooed performers specifically for Barnum and Bailey, but in circuses and dime museums. So, when we think about the Victorian period, we think a lot about repression, right? And one of the kind of points for examining that repression and the contrast between what was appropriate and what was kind of a little bit scary and interesting were tattoos. And so Annie performed as the tattooed Venus. Frank performed under a lot of different names, usually Dr. Franklin Howard. And they had all these different stories about their past, about how they became tattooed. None of them were true, but they were all very fantastical. Really, these two were both born in Providence to families who worked in the jewelry industry. That's probably how they met, we think. And Frank eventually became a really prominent tattooist in Boston and was kind of responsible for bringing the mechanized tattoo gun to Boston. Their daughter is also buried here, and she was known as the pint-sized snake charmer, because when you traveled with a circus, everybody worked, right? And I like talking about Frank and Annie because they were on the fringes of society in a lot of ways. Like, we know a little bit more about Annie than we do about other tattooed Venus performers, because on her way to an audition for a dime museum, she got catcalled and kind of harassed because you could still see some of her tattoos poking out of her clothing. So she slugged a guy and got arrested, and has like a jail record. So we can actually trace that record. And of course, when they hired her at the Dime Museum, they also hired her as like the woman who slugged a man, which I think is really funny. And they stayed married until they both passed away. They're buried together, but they were probably separated for the kind of end of their lives. Annie continued working in dime museums until she passed, and Frank had the kind of tattoo empire in Boston. Okay, the last guy we're going to talk about is George Henry, who I think out of all of the people that I've learned about at North Burial Ground, he probably had one of the biggest personalities here. George was born enslaved, but he escaped and he came to Rhode Island, and he had all sorts of jobs, but he made his fortune through a street cleaning business. So he owned like street cleaning and street wetting carts, because if you have like a dusty, like a dirt road, they would wet them down. He was a member of like every society you could be a member of, or a leader of every society you could be a member of. And he was an abolitionist and a civil rights advocate, especially for marriage equality and an end to school segregation. And he has a couple of different addresses in front of the Rhode Island General Assembly that are really interesting about especially the idea to end anti-miscegenation laws. And the reason that I say that he has one of the biggest personalities out of everybody that I've kind of encountered is that in addition to being a philanthropist and a civil rights advocate and the wealthiest Black man in Rhode Island at one time, he was also a memoirist. And when he died, he left a bunch of money to all these different societies that he belonged to, with the stipulation that they keep a copy of his memoir. And I just think that's such a move. You know, you can have the money, but also here's the chronicle of my life. And he's actually like he's part of a kind of proud tradition of Black memoirists from kind of the pre-Civil War era from New England. But he's kind of one of the lesser known ones, but his memoir is fascinating. Like part of the reason that he came to Rhode Island and how he escaped slavery was through basically becoming a ship's captain. He's a real character. Okay, so those are just a few of the people that you could meet when you come to North Burial Ground. And I find that people ask me this all the time: why cemeteries? And I think cemeteries make history real. When you come to a cemetery, you have all of these big trends. You can talk about landscape, you can talk about big moments in American history, especially a cemetery like North Burial Ground that is 76 years older than the Declaration of Independence, right? But you meet individuals in a cemetery in a way that you might not encounter them in your history books. They are a record of our past values. And, you know, for our cemetery, they're a record of our contemporary values too. Who is remembered, how they're memorialized, where in the cemetery they are, is all something that you can find here in a way that you won't find it maybe from reading an archive or reading a diary. And then here, especially in most cemeteries, there's a real connection to nature. Our cemetery, so I don't actually only run North Burial Ground, I have another cemetery too. And they're green spaces. We run them as parks, and we treat them as places where you can encounter nature in kind of this urban environment. We have coyotes who live here. We have a family of coyotes. They're very popular, and they're very, like, she owns the place. Hawks, rabbits, fireflies, which were once thought to be extinct in Rhode Island, I guess. I just learned this, but now they're very rare, I guess, but we have them here partially because of some no mow and leaf mulching activities. So we keep, we try to balance kind of the balance responsibility to take care of the headstones with some more kind of ecological conservation projects like mowing, leaf mulching, that kind of stuff. Butterflies, so many dragonflies. And one thing that I really fell in love with when I came to North Burial Ground, in my culture, there's a story that when you're visited by a dragonfly, you're being visited from somebody who is in the next world. And at North Burial Ground, we have tons of dragonflies. They're everywhere. So it's this really kind of special place, both naturally and culturally. And that is pretty much what I prepared for you. Oh, that's not true. Okay, so we do a bunch of stuff here. We do tours, we do moon hikes in partnership with the Roger Williams Park Museum, which is really fun. They come out, the director of the museum comes out, and we do astronomy and history together, which is really a blast. There are many self-guided online tours that you can access on our website. And I also do school and group tours by request. We have a bunch of events. One coming up soon is Edgar and Helen's birthday salon, which I'll tell you a little bit more about at the very end. We're starting a book club, which I think is going to be really fun. And then we have 3 big things to look out for. We have Sunday 1899, which is a celebration of North Burial Ground's kind of Victorian times, and folks come out in like full Victorian costume, which is very cool. We had a tintype photographer come out. We had carriage rides to the cemetery, which was like the ways to get around back in the cemetery when it was first when it was really at its heyday. We do a month of programming around Halloween, and then we do Day of the Dead on November 2nd every year. So lots of opportunities to connect and to come out. This is how you can be in touch with us. We do a quarterly newsletter. If you want to be included on that email newsletter, please just email us. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram if you're into social media. Come by the office. We're open Monday through Friday, 8 to 3:45. This is our website. If you just Google Providence North Burial Ground, we're the first one that comes up. And we are hosting Edgar and Helen's birthday salon. So they shared a birthday January 19th. We're not making it in time quite for their actual birthday, but we're gonna have a gathering here of we'll have a Poe scholar come and talk about Poe and Sarah Helen Whitman, and then we'll all share some poetry because I think that they would love that. It's the second time we've done it. We did it virtually last year, and now we're adding an in-person component, so it should be really fun. Okay, that's all I have for you. Thank you all for sharing that with me. It was really fun, and please let me know if you have any questions or if we have time for questions. I'm not sure what time you guys wanted to wrap up. I know I talked for a while.
We have a few minutes for questions, Annalisa.
Great.
A few minutes.
I see one in the chat. What are other largest burial sections, i.e. Armenian? So we have quite a few different ethnicities that are represented here. There's a large Greek population that comes for burials here, and the Armenians and the Greeks really came in the 50s and 60s. We also have a lot for the Islamic Center of Rhode Island, so we have a decent sized Muslim population that comes. And then it's literally everybody here, which is really cool. Any other questions?
Where is the entrance? Is it right on North Main Street or Branch Avenue?
So it is right where Branch Avenue and North Main Street kind of collide.
Right at that intersection? Right at the intersection?
Right at the intersection. So I'm going to scroll back to the map really quick. There is there's like a big roundabout.
Yeah.
In the front of the cemetery, and that is like, so here's North Main Street,
Yeah.
Here's Branch Avenue, and they like smoosh together.
Yeah.
And it's right there in that circle. There's like a big tree in the middle.
Okay.
And it's I'm not from Rhode Island, but everybody always tells me, oh, it's the cemetery where the BJs used to be. So
Okay. Yeah.
And you mentioned that it used to be non-discriminatory and then that changed. So when did it become non-discriminatory again? Or, after?
Oh, sure. So they had segregated burial places up until probably 1890. And then they stopped. Basically, it became reintegrated in the 1890s, early 1900s. But like when you look at the map here, and I know my mouse is hard to see, and this is a tiny map for anybody looking at the computer closely, but there's a section here, GF, and the name of that section using the the naming convention at the time was the colored free ground. So that was like specifically for Black and Indigenous people. And then across the way over here was the white free ground. So that was kind of the last officially recorded segregated sections of the cemetery.
So now it's not segregated.
Oh, not at all. No, no, no.
So
Yeah.
when did that happen? When did that change from segregated to non?
In the 1890s.
Yeah.
Is there one particular monument designer who's represented there?
No, there's at least so there are like quite a few. If you're into kind of old Rhode Island headstones, the Tingleys have quite a few. The Tingley shop from, I think they were in Newport, have quite a few headstones here, but it's everybody. So there's not like, there was never a time when we specifically sourced from one monument company.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always been kind of up to the families to put a headstone. And so we get a wide range of people.
Yeah.
And
so a lot of Rhode Island granite, I imagine.
Yes, there's a lot of Rhode Island granite, but our kind of main, honestly, well, now lots of granite. But most of our oldest stones are slate and they're still in great condition. So there are a lot of the oldest sections of the cemetery are slate headstones, and they hold up. They really do.
Wow. That's great.
Does the you're talking about fundraising. Does the cemetery have a friends group that tries to support?
Yeah, so we had a small friends group that kind of COVID and differing interests kind of disintegrated that over the last couple of years, and we're trying to kind of recolonize that and get a new friends group up and running. So it's kind of on our hope for list, basically.
Does the Brown family support, you know, with their wealth? I would think that the burial ground would be.
Annalisa, I have never heard of anyone having so much activity around the cemetery. It's seriously, it's so interesting. I didn't realize that you did tours and and then the events also, and the also what you were talking about with the wildlife in the area.
Yeah, we really, so I started here in 2021, and before me, there was a director, but before her, there wasn't really anybody in place, and she only stayed for about 2 years, and she really bore the brunt of COVID. So I really respect the work that she had to do through all of that.
Sure.
And I really came in at a time when we could grow, and we could grow into this this kind of model of doing programs and expanding capacity for fundraising. And one of the things that's very, very present in my mind is always that eventually North Burial Ground will run out of space. So like I said, we have about 100,000 burials. We have space for about 2,000 more in-ground full body burials, and a lot of space for cremation. But North Burial Ground will run out of room. And
that's like St. Anne's.
Yes, exactly.
They're out of room. I know. That's why they have that other one in Exeter.
Yep.
Someone sit there.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I've got a question. I noticed on the north end of the cemetery, there's a river.
Yep.
Right. So are there any issues with flooding, or
Yep.
odd to have a cemetery where a river runs through it?
So that is actually, it's smaller than you think. It's a canal. It's actually a piece of the Meshasset Canal. It's right back here, and it cuts through, and then it goes underground. So we do get a lot of ground upswell. We get like big pits of water, and the paving all along this area is in real rough shape because it gets groundwater coming up through it. And yeah, when we have a really heavy rain, it will flood. But not enough to cause any serious damage for the burials surrounding it, but enough that it's a concern.
Thank
Do
you.
you allow grave rubbings?
No grave rubbings, but we do a couple. One of the things I really encourage is if you're interested in collecting headstone data or taking pictures or getting headstone images, there's a couple different photography techniques that I'm always happy to teach people so they can kind of get a full picture. And then I also have a form, it's digital, that you can take out with you or access on your smartphone to fill out headstone like to do a headstone survey. So I teach those kind of survey methods. We do a couple big citizens that we call them citizen science days, where I try and get a group of people out to come and do that. But no, grave rubbings are actually, they do a lot of damage over time. And because we're such a big popular, like we're a popular place for people to come and do that kind of work, we really try and discourage it.
What is the other cemetery that you're in charge of?
Locust Grove. It's in South Providence. It's smaller. It was deeded to, it's only about 18 acres, I think. And it was deeded to this city in 1977. 77? Yeah. But was founded in the 1840s. And basically Locust Grove ran out of space, ran out of money, and the proprietors of it were like, what are we going to do with this? And the city took it over. There are still unused lots at Locust Grove. So sometimes we have people who've owned a lot there for a long time will come and need to be buried there. But for the most part, it's actually just like a nice, it kind of serves as a neighborhood park. It's really nice. It's getting like an entrance facelift. I'm really excited. We're getting like a whole new entrance. And then it's going to have a kind of wrought iron arch that says Locust Grove on the top of it. And there's been some really interesting in the 80s. There was a fruit tree planting plan in there for some reason. So it also has there's pear trees in Locust Grove and apple trees in Locust Grove. It's a really interesting place. It's worth a visit if you're ever in kind of the Elmwood area.
And where is that? Is that on Elmwood Avenue?
Yeah, it's on, it's between the name of the street. And it starts, I know where it is. I drive there, but I don't know the name of the street. So yeah, it's on Elmwood and
Broad Street and Elmwood in that area?
Yep. It's there's also Grace Church Cemetery is right there too, but it's not that one. So you got to keep up Broad Street a little bit.
Yeah.
Is there a story behind the door to the record vault?
No, so this building was built in 1886, and
It says 1700 on it.
well, that's because when we were founded, so it's got the founding
Oh,
date.
okay, so you just added that.
Yeah, no, I mean I didn't.
Somebody did.
Yeah, I think it's been like that since the 1880s for sure. It's old. And yeah, the handle has been replaced, and the lock has definitely been futzed with over time. Like you can see that somebody has come in and tried to take it out, but the combination is lost. But it's got these cool double doors, so you can still close and latch the double doors inside, and then it's all bricked in, and we keep all of our records in there and our vacuum. So vacuum is also fire.
How do you have regularly scheduled tours, or do you have to arrange them?
Oh, sorry. Yes. So I usually try and set my goal, knock on wood, is to get my tour schedule set by the first week of February. And then I try and do at least one a month. We do more in the summertime and around the fall, and basically every weekend in October we have stuff. We also participate in the Rhode Island Cemetery Awareness and Preservation Weeks, which Rhode Island Historic Preservation Commission and the Rhode Island Commission on Historic Cemeteries host. So those are March and April, and we do a bunch of programming around then. So there are a couple times a year where there's really intense programming, but there's through basically when the weather starts to turn good
Yeah,
There's at least one program a month, one tour a month.
I see.
Are you aware of any Indians buried there? Native Americans?
Yep, there are Native people buried here. So Christiana Bannister is Narragansett. And then there are also quite a few people who are identified as Narragansett in the lot for the Home for Aged Colored Women. But we don't always keep racial or ethnic information. So a lot of times you'll see in the records people identified as Native or Black, or if somebody was from an ethnicity that was like really unfamiliar to the sexton at the time, that would get noted. So we have like a handful of Chinese people buried here, and it like says it very largely in the record. Yeah, so the answer is yes, but the longer answer is there are more than there are more Native people buried here than are necessarily listed or identified as Native. There was a real interest in Native history and the relationship between Roger Williams and Canonicus that was really very present here at North Burial Ground. So we have this section that for a long time they called it Sachem's Glen, and there was a rock that they carved Canonicus into with like a little bow and arrow, and they had like a big ceremony celebrating putting up this monument, and there was a real interest in that. And then the rock moved to a spot on the west side of Providence on Federal Hill, the Canonicus stone, and then it went missing and no one knows where it is. So just a strange kind of piece of history.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Annalisa. That was a very interesting talk.
Well, thanks so much for having
It
me.
was, thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice, very nice. Before we leave, I just want to remind everyone that our next meeting will be in person, finally, and most likely at the community room in the police station, but we will send out a notice.